You didn't imagine the shift. One day they were warm, attentive, leaning in. The next, something invisible pulled away. And if you've been telling yourself, they just lost feelings, I want you to pause, because that explanation is comforting and completely wrong. What actually disappeared wasn't attraction. It wasn't love. It was something far more fragile. And once it's gone, everything else starts to collapse. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll see the moment it slipped through your fingers and why trying harder after that moment often makes things worse. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never hear. Feelings are emotional weather. Respect is the climate. Weather changes all the time. Climate shifts only after repeated patterns. So when someone pulls away suddenly, it's rarely because a feeling vanished overnight. It's because respect eroded quietly while you were busy doing what you thought was right. And yes, this applies whether you're dating, in a relationship, or stuck in that painful gray area where nothing is defined but everything hurts. Let me paint the picture. Think back to the early days. You had opinions. You had boundaries. You didn't over-explain. You weren't auditioning. You were choosing. And that energy, subtle, grounded, self-directed, created tension. Attraction fed on it. Respect was built on it. Then something shifted. Maybe you started bending more than standing. Maybe you became hyper-available. Maybe you swallowed discomfort instead of speaking it. Not because you're weak, but because you cared. Ironically, that's often the beginning of the end. And before you object, because I can already hear you thinking, so I'm not allowed to care, relax. Caring isn't the problem. Caring without self-respect is. There's a difference between being kind and being negotiable, between being loving and being endlessly accommodating. Respect doesn't disappear when you show emotion. It disappears when your emotions replace your standards. Here's where fear sneaks in. The fear of losing them makes you monitor your words. The fear of conflict makes you soften your truth. The fear of abandonment makes you overfunction in the relationship. You start doing emotional overtime, hoping they'll clock back in. And for a while, it seems to work. They stay, they text, they don't leave. But something else quietly exits the room. And once it's gone, no amount of affection can bring it back the same way. Let me interrupt this spiral with a question that might sting a little. Have you ever noticed how the more you explain yourself, the less they listen? Funny how that works. It's almost like attraction has selective hearing. And respect? Respect listens when you don't beg it to. What makes this urgent is that most people respond to lost respect by trying to be better, more patient, more understanding, more loving. But that response often accelerates the decline. Because what's missing isn't proof of your feelings. It's proof that you still choose yourself. And in a moment, I'm going to show you the exact behavior that signals respect is fading long before they pull away, and why ignoring it costs you leverage you didn't even know you had. There's a very specific moment when respect begins to slip, and it rarely looks dramatic. No shouting, no breakup speech. It usually shows up as something deceptively small. A boundary you don't enforce, a joke you laugh off that actually stings, a pattern you notice, but explain away because you don't want to seem difficult. And this is where most people misunderstand what respect actually is. Respect isn't about how nicely someone treats you when things are easy. It's about how they respond when there's friction, and more importantly, how you respond when there's friction. Think about it. Early on, if someone canceled last minute, you might have calmly said, "That doesn't really work for me." Not angrily, not dramatically, just clearly. And notice how different that feels from later, when the same behavior shows up and you say, "It's okay, I get it," while quietly hoping they'll notice how understanding you're being. One response signals self-worth. The other signals fear of loss. And human beings, no matter how kind, how loving, respond differently to each. This is where the story takes a turn most people don't expect, because the person pulling away often isn't doing it consciously. They're not sitting there thinking, "I respect you less now." What they're experiencing is a subtle shift in polarity. The dynamic changes. You move from being someone who challenges their world slightly to someone who orbits it. And orbiting doesn't create desire. It creates comfort, predictability, safety without tension, and comfort without tension doesn't spark effort. It invites complacency. Here's a slightly uncomfortable but liberating idea. People don't value what's endlessly available. Not because they're cruel, but because value is created through choice. When you stop choosing yourself, You remove the very thing that made choosing you meaningful. It's like saying yes to everything and then wondering why the yes stopped mattering. At some point, your presence stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like a guarantee. Let me break the tension for a second, because if you're sitting there thinking, so what? I'm supposed to act cold and unavailable? No, please don't turn this into a personality transplant. This isn't about playing games. It's about alignment, about your words, actions, and standards pointing in the same direction. Respect grows when people feel that being with you is a privilege, not an entitlement. And that doesn't come from distance. It comes from discernment. The dangerous phase is what comes next. This is when you sense the pullback and your instinct is to close the gap emotionally. You text more, you explain more, you ask more questions, not out of curiosity, but out of anxiety. You're trying to restore closeness, but what you're actually doing is highlighting the imbalance. And imbalance is where attraction goes to quietly die. Here's the part most people miss. And if you miss this, you repeat the pattern forever. The loss of respect doesn't begin with them. It begins with the moment you betray your own boundaries to keep the connection alive. That's the moment the story shifts from two people choosing each other to one person auditioning to be chosen. And coming up, I'm going to show you why pulling back emotionally is often the worst advice, and what actually rebuilds respect without pushing someone away. At this point, most advice online tells you to disappear. Go silent, be mysterious, vanish, and hope absence does the heavy lifting. And I need you to hear this clearly. Silence without self-respect is just sulking with better branding. It doesn't rebuild anything. In fact, when respect was lost because you abandoned yourself, disappearing only confirms the story that you don't know where you stand. Respect isn't restored through distance alone, it's restored through grounded presence. Here's what actually changes the dynamic, and it's far subtler than people expect. You stop negotiating with reality. You stop trying to convince someone to treat you well. You stop explaining why your needs make sense. And instead, you start responding to what is, not what you hope might return. That shift is powerful because it's quiet, it's not dramatic, and it immediately changes how you're perceived. Let me give you an example. Imagine they cancel plans again. The old version of you might say, no worries, totally understand, while feeling disappointed and slightly resentful. The new version doesn't lecture, doesn't punish, doesn't over-accommodate. They simply say, that doesn't work for me tonight. Let's connect another time. And then they actually go live their life. Not to prove a point, but because their life matters. That difference is everything. Notice what's missing here. No emotional dump, no strategic delay, no icy withdrawal, just self-trust. And here's the irony. Self-trust is magnetic, not because it's flashy, but because it signals something deeply attractive. You're not afraid of an outcome you can handle. When someone feels that, they either rise to meet it, or they step away faster. Both outcomes are clarity, and clarity is respect's best friend. This is where excitement creeps back into the story, not necessarily for them yet, but for you. Because when you stop chasing reassurance, your nervous system settles. You're no longer scanning texts like they're medical results. You're no longer reading tone like it's Morse code. You become calmer, more centered. And paradoxically, that's often when they start leaning back in, not because you pulled away, but because you stopped leaning over. Let me ask you something that might sound simple, but isn't. When was the last time you chose yourself without announcing it, without hoping they'd notice? That's the muscle that rebuilds respect. Quiet decisions, kept promises to yourself, a life that doesn't pause waiting for someone else to decide your value. Now here's the twist most people aren't prepared for. Sometimes when you reestablish self-respect, the other person doesn't come back. And that can feel like failure until you realize something crucial. What you lost wasn't the relationship. It was the illusion that sacrificing yourself would secure love. And once that illusion is gone, you don't panic the same way anymore. You don't cling. You don't shrink. You grieve, but with dignity. And in the final part, I'm going to show you how to tell without guessing, without overanalyzing, whether respect can still be rebuilt or whether the most powerful move is walking away with your self-worth intact. There's a quiet question everyone asks at this stage, even if they don't say it out loud. Is this still salvageable, or am I just delaying the inevitable? And the reason this question feels so heavy is because most people look for the answer in the wrong place. They look for reassurance, for signs, for texts that arrive faster, for affection that feels like the beginning again. But respect doesn't announce its return with grand gestures. It shows up in something far more telling: responsiveness to your standards. Here's how you know the difference. When you stop overgiving and start honoring yourself, pay attention to what happens next. Do they adjust? Not perfectly, not instantly, but do they make an effort that feels conscious? Do they take your boundaries seriously, even if they don't love them? Or do they resist, minimize, guilt you, or suddenly accuse you of changing? That reaction tells you everything, because someone who respects you doesn't punish you for having limits. They learn how to meet you inside them. This is where urgency matters. The longer you stay in a dynamic where respect isn't mutual, the more you normalize emotional debt. You start telling yourself stories like, they're just busy, or they're not great at expressing feelings, while slowly training yourself to accept less than you need. And the danger isn't that you'll lose them. The danger is that you'll lose your internal compass, the part of you that knows when something feels off and trusts that knowledge. Let me lighten this for a moment, because if relationships came with warning labels, half of them would just say, may cause you to doubt your own standards. And yet, here you are, trying to be the emotionally evolved one while quietly shrinking. That's not growth. That's erosion disguised as patience. The moment respect truly begins to return, or reveals it never will, is when you stop managing their comfort at the expense of your truth. You speak plainly, you don't threaten, you don't negotiate your worth. You simply state what works for you and let the response land. This is terrifying for many people because it removes control. You're no longer steering the outcome, you're observing it. But observation is powerful. It gives you information without distortion. And here's the part that often surprises people. When respect comes back, it doesn't feel euphoric at first. It feels stable. Conversations become clearer. Plans feel more intentional. There's less confusion, less emotional whiplash. It's not fireworks, it's footing. And if instead you feel more anxious, more uncertain, more like you were walking on eggshells, that's not love struggling to survive. That's you struggling to be accepted in a space that no longer fits. This is where fear tries one last trick. It whispers, but what if this is the best I'll get? That fear has kept more people in misaligned relationships than lack of options ever has. Because when you believe love requires self-abandonment, you cling to whoever tolerates the pieces of you that remain. In the final part, I'm going to show you how reclaiming respect, whether they stay or go, becomes the moment your dating life fundamentally changes, and why the next connection you enter feels entirely different from the ones that came before. When you reclaim your self-respect, something profound happens that has nothing to do with whether they come back. Your entire posture toward love changes. You stop entering relationships as someone hoping to be chosen and start showing up as someone deciding if the connection is worthy of your energy. That shift alone rewrites the ending of this story, because respect, once rebuilt internally, becomes non-negotiable externally. Here's what most people don't realize until much later. The pain you felt wasn't just about losing them. It was about losing yourself in the process of trying to keep them. And when you finally draw the line, not in anger, not in desperation, but in clarity, you feel something unexpected: relief. Not the kind that comes from closure speeches or dramatic exits, but the quiet relief of alignment. Your words match your actions again. Your standards stop wobbling based on someone else's mood. This is where excitement returns, not the anxious, adrenaline-fueled excitement of uncertainty, but the grounded excitement of possibility. Because now you're no longer attracted to people who make you prove your worth. You notice how quickly that old pull fades. Mixed signals become uninteresting. Emotional inconsistency feels exhausting instead of intriguing. And that alone filters your dating life more effectively than any strategy ever could. Let me pause here with a question that reframes everything. What if the reason this hurts so much is because it was preparing you for a higher standard, not punishing you for caring? People often think heartbreak lowers their confidence, but in reality, it exposes where confidence was outsourced. Once you bring it back home, you don't chase the same dynamics again, not because you're guarded, but because you're awake. And here's the paradox that ties this entire story together. When you no longer fear losing someone who doesn't respect you, you become someone who's deeply respected, not by everyone, but by the right people. The ones who don't require you to shrink, explain, or perform emotional gymnastics to be valued. Respect doesn't demand perfection, it demands self-honesty. So whether they circle back or fade out becomes secondary. If they return, it's to a version of you who won't repeat the old dance. If they don't, they make space for someone who meets you without needing to be taught how. Either way, you win, not because you hardened your heart, but because you stopped betraying it. And the next time someone pulls away, you won't ask, what did I do wrong? You'll ask something far more powerful. Does this dynamic honor who I am? That question alone protects your future because they didn't lose feelings. They lost respect. And the moment you reclaimed yours was the moment the story finally turned in your favor.